Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name's Katie, I'm a mixed media artist, and today I want to share with you my favourite art supplies. So I've picked out a wide range of materials, including brush pens, coloured pencils, neocolors and gouache, as well as my favourite little tools, my palette and my favourite sketchbook. So I hope this video is helpful and interesting if you've always wanted to know what colours I use. I basically use a variation of these in every piece, as well as obviously topping out with all my other art supplies. But these are my top supplies if I had to really narrow it down and take them with me. I'm going to be recording a process video as well at the end of this, using these supplies, so do stick around if you want to see some artwork being made and how I use these all together. We've got a lot to get through, so let's jump right in with sharing my favourite supplies with you all. So I'm going to start with my favourite sketchbook, and as you can see I use these a lot. These are the Royal Talens 13 by 21 centimeter sketchbook, and this is, I would say, the sketchbook I reach for most of the time. These are all filled with daily artwork, and these two are my current sketchbooks that I'm still working in. But these ones are the filled ones. I've been working in here for quite a few years and they're definitely my favourite sketchbook because they're very affordable, so I don't get as anxious when I'm working them that something has to be good because I know that it doesn't have to be super precious. I have one sketchbook that is quite expensive and I definitely feel the fear when I'm working in it. So these Royal Talens ones are great. They are the Art Creation sketchbook. They're 140 GSM, so the paper's not too thick. It holds mixed media really well, so I've used a lot of medium in here. I've used pan pastel, gouache, acrylic paint, and it holds it all very well. I would just say that if you're using really watery paint, sometimes the page can buckle and will show through on the other side. They do other sizes in this, but this is my preferred size, and like I said, just an easy size to grab and take with you for plein air work and day-to-day sketchbooking. If you've seen any of my YouTube videos before, you might recognise this little tin, which is where I store all of my gouache paint. I'm a huge lover of gouache, and this is traditional gouache, so this isn't acrylic gouache. I've actually never used that, but I want to share my top 5 shades, which was quite hard to narrow down, but these are the ones that I think I can't live without. Most of these I bought second-hand or on sale. Gouache is quite an expensive medium. For one of these tubes it's between £4 and £5, so they're not cheap. So I definitely recommend going second-hand if you can. A lot of these I bought from eBay. One of the things you've just got to be wary of is that they might dry out. So if they haven't been stored properly in the past, like with this one, it's really hard to squeeze. I can just about get it to the end, but definitely something to be wary of. But they are often on sale, so definitely worth keeping an eye out. And although I do have quite a few here, I've built up my collection over quite a few years. So here are my top 5 shades. I like to use Winsor & Newton or Rowney Designer's Gouache. I find that they're basically the same. I don't really find any difference between them, and I can mix them together without any problems. So I have tried some cheaper gouache before, but I definitely think these are the best. This is the white, so I use white to mix most of my shades. I use it in every single painting. So instead of buying these quite expensive individual tubes, because I go through them quite a lot, I actually prefer to buy them in bulk. So this huge tube here is 220ml, whereas this one is only 14ml. So I think this one was about £10 and this one was £5. So definitely a big difference there. And because I am mixing it with other colours, I find that it's totally fine. I haven't had any problems mixing with cheaper white gouache. I have also used the Royal Talens white jar before, which is also really good, but I go through this so much, so it's definitely worth it if you do too on buying a bigger tube. My next shade is the 223 Burnt Umber. I very rarely use black in my work, so this is really handy when I want to create a darker shade, because I'll just mix this in instead. It gives a really nice dark tone, and I find that it's got a really nice warm tint to it. Then my favourite yellow, which is Cadmium Yellow Hue 620. This one's from Rowney but I love to mix this with green, which I'll come on to in a minute. This one doesn't actually have any cadmium pigment in, so there's no worries about the toxicity of cadmium because this is the hue shade. But like I said, I really love mixing this with my favourite shade of green, which is 556 Oxide of Chromium. This is really nice to use on its own for darker greens, so trees and hedges in the distance and grass, but mixing it with the yellows is like my trademark green. I really love the way that it mixes and the really warm green it creates. And then lastly is the primary blue. So I very rarely use this on its own. I'm almost always mixing it with white, and I use this for my sky shades and some water. So following on from the gouache, I also want to talk about some accessories I use with it, and most importantly is the paintbrushes. So I'm actually not brand loyal with paintbrushes. I'm happy to use whatever I have, but I really like the round brushes, and specifically this size 10. This is from the Graduate range by Rowney, and I found this to be a really affordable range, so I definitely recommend them. You can get a really wide mark with it because it does go quite thick, but you can also taper at the end of the brush so you can get quite fine details as well. I just find it to be a really good all-rounder brush, so definitely one I recommend. And then this here is my messy palette, but this is actually a Rowney Tear-Off Palette. For all of the things that I'm mentioning, I will link them down below, so if I've missed anything or if you want to know something in more detail, it should all be in the description box. But this tear-off palette has been a game changer for me because I don't have to wash any dirty palettes or put any paint pigments down the sink. Although it is creating a bit more paper waste, I actually reuse these paper sheets. So you can see here when I'm using the gouache quite thick, it leaves the pigment on the page. It's less effective when you are adding more water, but especially with acrylics, I find that they work really well for collage papers. So I keep all of my tear-off sheets in a little folder, and I will bring that out when I want to add collage to my work and just cut from here rather than cutting coloured paper. And it's really nice because it has different shades in anyway, so it adds a lot more texture. But once I've filled this sheet, then I'll just tear it off like this and start a new one underneath, and then keep this in my collage folder. With the gouache, it does reactivate, so I can reuse this palette until there's no white at all. I often put on quite a lot onto my palette spread, so where you can see like the bigger globs of paint, I can just re-wet them with my brush and remix on top of that. So I think they're really great for that. Some more little accessories I want to share because you'll probably see these in my Instagram photos and my flat lays most of the time. I really like using clips to hold my paper down, especially when I'm working outside. It's really handy if it's windy to hold the sheets in place. But I also find it's really helpful for photographing work because I can just clip these at the side of the page. These are a bit more handy when photographing because they are smaller and don't get in the way. But holding the page flat is really helpful when you are working in a sketchbook. These little metal clips are quite old, but I have found similar on Amazon, and these Penco Clampy clips were bought at the London Graphic Centre when I went to London earlier this year. And then an important piece of kit for an artist is a pencil sharpener. This is the Derwent Pastel and Charcoal pencil sharpener. It's a really good size, so it does fit in neocolors and also luminance. So those are slightly thicker, so sometimes they don't fit into regular sharpeners. But this one's really good because it gives a really nice sharp point, and I have found that my previous sharpener that I used to use all the time, although it was a great size, it didn't get me that really sharp point. It was still quite blunt on the end, whereas this one is great for that, so I can get really refined lines. And this was recommended to me by Lucia Layfield. Okay, so now onto brush pens. I really love using both Tombows and Ecoline brush pens, which is from Royal Talens. I do work with Tombow. I am one of their brand ambassadors and work with them on the Tombow collective. But I have built up my collection over many years and used them for ages. So although some of them are gifted, most of them I have bought myself, including these ones here. But I want to talk about the Ecoline ones. I really like these because they are refillable. You can take off the nib unscrew it, and then you can refill it with the Ecoline ink, which I really like. It means less plastic waste, and you've also got a spare nib there, so you can turn that around if the other nib gets a bit worn out. So I really like that. And you can also just use the inks on their own as well when you buy them, because you get a huge little bottle of it. These are my favourite shades for the Ecolines. So this is the 728 Warm Grey Light and the 704 Grey. I really like using these for rocks and also clouds in the sky, especially this lighter one. And then this other one is the 381 Pastel Red. This is a really nice warm red. It's really soft, and I love this for rooftops and also buildings. I think it just adds a really nice warmth instead of just using a beige. But when I do want to use a beige, this one is a really nice one. This is the Tombow 942. You can see on a lot of these the writing has worn off because I have used them so much. But this is a really nice base shade. This one is running out, but it's still a staple in my collection. And then I've got two green shades here. So I have a lot of greens in Tombows, but these I would say are my favourites. So I've got the 126, which again is that really nice yellow green, and the 158, which is slightly darker. It's more of a mid-green, slightly cooler as well, but I really like using this for trees in the distance and hedgerows, and then this one works great for grass and fields. This one is slightly different for me because it's not as sort of nature-based as the rest, but this one is the 553. I've really been enjoying using this more lately, and it's definitely made its way up to my top 5. So this is really nice for shadow tones, I found, and I've used this a lot as well for buildings, and it just gives a bit of contrast and it's a bit different from the grey. And then lastly the 491, which is a really pale blue. I used to use a different one for sky blues, but this one is a lot cooler and I think it's a really nice shade for the sky. Onto neocolors next, and this is the set of 40. So I was bought this as a present, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting a huge set to start with. I always suggest going for a few of them to see if you like them. I know that art can very well lean into consumerism, and I definitely think it's more important to have something that you'll use in your studio, so I'm always quite wary of what I share and what I buy. What I find when I am wanting to try a new medium is to just buy a couple, so that's what I did with my pan pastels. I just bought a few shades to see if it does work with my style and how I can use them in my art, and that's what I always recommend with things like neocolors as well. If you like doing landscapes, then get some greens and some more natural shades. You can see here I very rarely use this half, which is the brighter reds and purples, simply because I mostly do landscapes, so I mostly use these colours, and I have built up a box of other shades. So I've got two little boxes where I've bought the pastels individually and built up my collection that way. But I'm going to go through my top 5, which was quite difficult to narrow down, but I think these are the ones that would be my desert island disc items. So because I do use them so much, you can see they are broken and tattered, and that's because I do press quite hard. I like to create really bold lines, and if I'm not careful they do snap. This one here I've replaced because it literally turned into tiny nubs which are hard to use, but this is the light olive shade. This pairs really nicely with the olive as well if you wanted a light and a dark, but this one is great for fields and lawns, and I just think it's a really nice shade of green. It's not super bright or unnatural. I think you can use this for a lot of different things. And then we have the light cobalt blue. This is actually quite recent for me. I bought this last December. I was really wanting to find a nice sky blue, and this one definitely ticked all the boxes. It's similar to that Tombow, and it's just a really nice, quite a warm blue. It's perfect for skies and also for water. And then these three are a little bit wild from my usual neutrals and landscape colours, but I really enjoy using these for pops of colour. This is the salmon pink. I really like doing this for highlights along horizons, and also this one. The English name is sky blue, which I don't agree with. It's more of a cornflower lilac blue. I would say this one should be sky blue. but it's a really nice shade. It's quite warm, but again, it gives you that pop of colour. And then this one is Lemon Yellow. I definitely need to get a new one of this. You can see I have sharpened these, which I don't often do, but I used the Derwent pastel sharpener for that. And I really like using this for lawn lines. I like to use it on grassy fields just to add a bit of line work to kind of draw the eye. It's just a really good one for highlights. Okay, so now on to my favourite coloured pencils. This was really tricky to narrow down because obviously I have a lot of pencils and I use them the most. I think these would be the supply that I couldn't live without. My favourite brand is the Caran d'Ache Luminance 6901 pencils. These are really great, strong and sturdy pencils. I used to use Prismacolors a lot, but I did find that they snapped all of the time and the leads were quite broken inside the pencils, whereas the Luminance are super sturdy and I haven't had any problems with snapping or when I sharpen. There is a Derwent drawing one in here as well, which gets an extra mention because this is my favourite white. This is their Chinese White 7200. And I really like this one because it's not chalky, it actually kind of feels like a pastel. It goes over most of my mediums, including gouache, and I haven't found any other white that does it just as good as this one. And then in terms of my favourite Luminance colours, we've got the 077 Burnt Ochre. This is a really nice warm brown shade. It's not dark, it's more like a terracotta, but I really like using this for line work on my panels and rooftops. It's a really nice choice if you don't want to use a darker brown. And then you can see I love my sky blues. This is the light cobalt blue 651. So this one does match really well with the neocolor you can see there. But I really love this one for colouring, and the Luminance can be used like on their side as well for nice texture. And then I've got two greens here. This one is the 719 Dark Thalocyanine Green and the Olive Yellow 015. I use these two most of the time together. This is really good for blades of grass and again trees and hedges in the distance. And then this one is really nice just to put down a huge amount of colour for grass. This is also really nice for highlights. This one looks almost black, but it is a really dark green, and I just think that they pair really nicely together. And then this one is another one that looks like it's black but is actually a really dark blue. This is Dark Indigo 639. I've been loving this for line work lately and to add some contrast to my pieces, so this has become a fast favourite. So this isn't by any means all of the art supplies that I have to narrow down for my favourites. I haven't included pan pastels or oil pastels, for example. But one thing I did want to mention here at the end is this beige Posca. This is an acrylic paint pen, so I don't have many of these in my collection, so I can't really pick like my top 5, but this is definitely up there with my favourite materials. I use this all of the time. It's a really great background shade because it is a really nice warm neutral. This is the 8mm chisel shaped tip, and I just find it really helpful for putting down a huge block of colour. I find that things layer really nicely with this and it gives a really nice base. So I'm going to show you how I use it and all of these materials here in an illustration. So I'm only going to be using the colours I picked out as my favourites, and I'm going to show you the process for a spread in my sketchbook. So I hope you enjoy, and on to the process video. So instead of doing swatches, I thought I would just show you them in action, and hopefully this is a good way for you to see how I use them, how I combine them all together into an actual illustration, rather than just swatching them out. I start in my Royal Talens sketchbook, and I'm actually using the beige Posca to draw my panels. I've really loved using this, as I mentioned when I was talking about the Posca, as a base layer. So it creates a really nice warmth underneath, and I think it just gives a nice contrast to anything I'm putting on top, and it does change the colours slightly. So I layer gouache on top of this, and I do use my brush pens, which I'm not sure I would recommend, but I wanted to show you them in the video. So the brush pens don't come out exactly the same colour as you'd see on the nib. I do find with Tombows anyway that the nib or the lid of the pen isn't actually accurate to the swatches. So I definitely recommend swatching the pens first. but it does pick up some of the acrylic from the pen, so you're going to see that in a minute. But I am swatching out all of my favourite gouache that I shared with you and mixing up my sky colour first. If you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know this is usually my starting point because I try and keep it a really nice clean blue and I don't want it to get muddied. I'm putting down the primary blue, which I've mixed with the white, and here I am coming in with the brush pen. So it is adding on some texture back there, and here I am with my 553, so it's not exactly the colour that it is, but it does layer on pretty well. I was quite surprised. Usually I just use Tombows on their own, so if I'm putting Posca down first, then I would just use gouache, but I did want to show you the effects. I came in with some gouache on top of that water, and now I'm putting on some of the pencil, and I do find the eco line works better just because they are thicker and juicier than the Tombows when I am working over gouache. So that's something I do often. Instead of over the Posca, I use brush pens on the gouache, which you'll also see later. I keep my gouache quite wet and watery, and I'm just sort of layering different things. I don't use one thing at a time. I tend to mix things up. I'll use some gouache, then I'll use some brush pens, then I'll come back to gouache, and just keep mixing as I go. It's very intuitive. My process is definitely changeable depending on what I'm painting or drawing, and I just find that a really nice way to work. I don't have any set rules. I'll just change things up depending on what I think the painting or the drawing needs. And whilst I add in some more gouache here, and you can watch me layer things up, I thought I'd just share some information about the spread that I'm creating here. So this is a technique and idea that I did on a session with Emma Carlisle in her Patreon, which was a session about zooming in on narratives. So I've got 4 bubbles which I've drawn out on my page, and I found the references from Pexels. I will again link anything down below, so I'll put the references down there as well. But these were quite random references. They weren't linked together at all in terms of being the same photographer, and were quite different in terms of what they showed, but I wanted to link them together to create one narrative. And the idea with each panel is that it's zooming in each time. So this landscape one was a really nice picture, but obviously there was no house there, and I knew I wanted to have a house in the narrative, so I added one in. And then the second panel is a closer look at that house, and then again we're zooming into the roof where there's a heron on the roof, and then zooming in again to his face. And I just think it's a really nice way to add narrative to your work, which is something I definitely want to explore. And it's really nice to be able to change the references to work with what I want to draw, so like adding in the house and adding in the bird. Here you can see the eco line going really nicely over the Posca. I do find that it picks up less on the eco line than it does on the Tombow, but it does layer really nicely, and I was quite surprised, especially with the amount of sort of juice in those pens. And then obviously coming in with my gouache as well. So it was really helpful for me to put down the house first so I could work around it. This one was similar in the reference, but I did change the background slightly just to try and make it work with what I've drawn above, because obviously the idea is that I'm just zooming in there, and this original reference obviously wasn't part of that landscape, so I did have to change that slightly to make it work, but I'm really pleased with the result on this one. I think it turned out really nicely, and it was really nice to be able to use all these favourite supplies. It does feel like a very me spread, and I think that is because of the colours and the palette that I'm using, as well as all the different textures and the usual things I like to add in. So it just feels very much in my comfort zone, and I was really pleased with the end result. So I'm coming in with some pencil here and the neocolor to add some texture onto the water. I really like using the pencils to add on extra texture, and adding in some shading with the eco lines. They layer really nicely on lots of things, and so I definitely find that that's how I work. I'll put down a base layer and then I'll work on top, whether that's with more texture, details, or with extra shading. I'm adding in some white gouache here for the heron on top of the roof, and it is a really nice thick white, so that's just the pure Pebeo white that I like to use, and I've mixed that in with the blue as well to keep the sky the same. And I like to stylize my clouds quite a lot, so you can definitely see that in this spread and doing sort of bubble clouds, but I really like the way that they look. Obviously I've got the peachy tone from the beige Posca underneath, so I fill in the clouds with the white again, and it's not super clean, like you can see a lot of the brush marks, but I really like that effect. I definitely lean into the texture that gouache makes. I'm not trying to make it super clean and like a really defined block color, because that's what I was trying to do when I first started using gouache, and I just found it was really difficult for me, so I kind of just lean into the texture and I find that works better for my style. So again, I'm coming in with the white and the blue first so that it doesn't get muddy, and coming back to the second panel and adding in some white for some wildflowers in front of this house, which was something I really liked about the reference, so I wanted to add that in. And I do go back on that top panel just to add a little hint of white to suggest that that is there in that top picture. And then being quite careful, here you can see I'm using that round brush and getting a defined point with it, so it is quite versatile. And then just adding a bit more texture into that heron's neck with the white. I didn't use the white pencil massively on here, but I do find it helpful on darker areas for adding on some white over the top. Definitely the best white pencil I've found. And now coming in with some luminance and brush pen to add some colour to the heron, and defining some of the shape with the pencil around it. I really like to layer on some coloured pencil and the neocolor over sky, so if I do just do a gouache base, I like to add on pencil texture and neocolor on top, even if it's the same colour, because I do find it blends things a bit nicer and just adds more texture on top. So these parts are definitely my favourite. I love to add in details on the houses. I like to add in the little windows and the lines on the roof, as well as making it look like a little wooden hut by adding lines down the main colour. And we're almost there with this one, so I definitely enjoyed this one. I'm really pleased with the end result, like I said. I love to add extra texture, and so that's something I'm trying to do, especially when I'm not on a timer, of like really building up that texture and working into the piece, whereas with my usual timed ones I don't have time for that. Here I am coming in with the extra highlights with the brighter neocolors, so I think the pink really works in this one, especially against the tones of the rest of the page. I think it just works really nicely with the colours in this spread. And then the last marks, which are the darker grasses in that front one. So here's some close-ups of the end result. I think that the balance is a little bit off with all of the blue on the right, but I'm really pleased with the heron. I think that works really nicely, and I did go back to the second panel just to add him on top in the roof. So I hope this video was helpful in learning all about my art supplies. If you did like it, then please do hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, because it really helps me. So I hope you have a wonderful week ahead, and I will see you next Sunday with a new YouTube video. See you later.